Welcome to this lecture on the Chicago School and the origins of American sociology. So from this lecture onwards, we will move more from the European classics on towards American sociology. And the Chicago School is often seen as the starting point of American sociology, even though, as you have heard already, Webb Du Bois published most of his works before the Chicago School actually emerged in the 1890s and 1900s. In this lecture, I will briefly present the historical setting in which the Chicago School emerged. This also relates to the reading of today. I will then present the main theoretical strands that are associated with the Chicago School, most notably symbolic interactionism, speech act theory, and also a pragmatist model of action. So the Chicago School is associated also with the philosophical current of American pragmatism. Last but not least, I will point to some of the Chicago School's legacies. So let's start a little bit with the historical background. So Chicago was founded in 1831, and as the name Chicago School already suggests, the school did not only originate in the city of Chicago, but was also very much associated with it as a kind of urban laboratory. The city witnessed an enormous growth, up to 1.7 million in 1900. And was also the site of, let's say, a rapidly changing social environment with these strike waves in the 1890s, also Pullman City, the railway car producer who had constructed a company town where he owned everything up to the church. And in which a violent strike also erupted in the 1890s. Chicago was a town of immigrants, with more than 50% of the population being foreign born. Being the center also in the Midwest of the meatpacking industry with Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, one of the most impactful social novels of the time, still reporting about the bad working conditions in the meatpacking industry. Chicago was also the destination of large parts of the Great Migration, so the large resettlement of southern blacks to northern industrial cities starting around World War I. And Chicago was home also to many of the European immigrants, most notably of the second wave of southeastern European immigrants. So in this rapidly changing city, then the Chicago School of Sociology emerged with the Chicago University and a first chair of sociology being founded in the 1890s. Alvin Small was the first holder of the chair. A first generation then of Chicago sociologists studied in a way the city as a sociological laboratory, and also used parts of the settlement house movement, we will come to this in a second, as a window into the city's problems. So settlement houses were originally a British invention of social reformers, founding a kind of settlement house that served in a way as a communal living space to social reformers, often middle-class women, actually, who in a way helped with any kind of social problems in the neighborhoods the settlement houses were situated in. And simultaneously, these settlement houses were also a way of doing sociology very much related to social works. A second generation then of Chicago school sociologists emerged in the interwar years when community studies became a central publication outlet and methodology of the Chicago School. We'll come to this also in a second. So most important names associated with the school: Alvin Small, I already mentioned as the first holder of the chair of sociology, George Herbert Mead. We'll talk about his symbolic interactionism. Isaac Thomas, most known for the Thomas theorem. We will get to this. And then Robert Park and Ernest Burgess as the founders of urban sociology. All of these founding fathers, were of rural and often conservative Christian background. Christian sociology was actually an association of early sociologists and informed also the foundation of American sociology. This is very different from the more secular and also much more urban bourgeoisie-focused European origins of sociology. Many of these founders also had a background of studies in Europe and in Germany. Alban Small, George Herbert Mead, for instance, were influenced by Hegel and also the German historical school, and thought about sociology as a kind of historical sociology. Already at this time, very much in the pre-McCarthy era, socialism was an anathema. Sociology, sharing also the Stoch radical with socialism, was anything but socialist in its origin, perhaps only Christian socialist if you want. But already at this time, with a radicalized workers' movement in the 1890s, socialism was not a choice in the foundation of American sociology. It is also important to mention the importance of women in the creation of American sociology. There was a relatively clear gender segregation already from the start, with the men founding fathers that I mentioned making an academic career and often focusing more on theoretical writings, and the women founders then working in the settlement movement and being closer to a social works career, many of them also becoming members of the international peace movement in and after the First World War, and the second generation also moving into the social reform policy consultants of the New Deal. An example of this kind of career is Emily Belch, who you also find in the optional reading. So also an early sociologist who worked on immigrants up to 1920, when social works and her involvement in the peace movement became much more important. And women sociologists often taught also in women's colleges. And there was also a certain topic divide with the early female sociologist Jane Addams, we will talk about today, focusing more on urban housing, family and home. At that time, with the exception of Webb Du Bois, a sociology of race was less of a topic. This became more prominent than after the racial riots of 1918, when also the Rockefeller Foundation started funding sociology much more, with also works on the problem of race in the US. The Chicago School is associated not only with, let's say, certain topics and certain theories, but also with a set of methods that make it unique. A first kind of method are biographical or life course studies, so an early version of oral history, interviews, also making use of diaries or letters. A second important technique is participant observation, or just seeing life. So in books like The Street Corner Society, then a classical method then also of the settlement workers is obviously to take part in the social life while simultaneously observing it, and in a way being opposed then to the kind of armchair philosophy that many of the male founding fathers also practiced. A third technique is also the use of social geography and mapping, mapping also census information, and last but not least, community studies. So these are case studies of singular neighborhoods, sometimes even entire towns with a particular focus. Sometimes, for instance, the impact of the Great Depression on a certain community, and using a rich array of material from census materials to yes, interviews, I don't know, counting the number of steps per minute of pedestrians. And Webb Du Bois' Philadelphia study, right, was already such a community study before this kind of genre became most famous then in the interwar years. These kind of case studies at Chicago are also opposed to Giddings' inductive sociology. This is the book of the 1900s approach at Columbia University in New York, where Giddings rather followed Karl Pearson's, so this Swedish, one could say racist and statistician, whom you still know for his Pearson correlation coefficient nowadays. And Giddings followed this approach to make correlations of publicly available statistics and inductive sociology the core focus and methodology of early sociology. The idea here being to not use sort of individual singular case studies, but moving sociology rather into the realm also of a nomological kind of science. And perhaps it is not a coincidence then that at Columbia University after the Second World War, the quantitative survey sociology with Paul Lazarsfeld saw its origins. Yes, the probably most notable theories associated with the Chicago School, which is fundamentally a very empiricist kind of sociology, still is symbolic interactionism associated with Josh Herbert Mead and Herbert Blumer, and a pragmatist theory of action that builds on the tradition of American pragmatism. As you may have seen in the reading for today, sociology at the time was not necessarily a very academic enterprise only. It was much more about social reformers, also influencing legislation and organizing in social reform think tanks. This also happened in Europe, but probably was much more prominent in the United States. We are talking about the progressive era, right, where progressivist third party emerged temporarily on the national and local level in the United States, when progressivists organized in favor of municipal reforms. They criticized that urban governance in the United States was very much about sort of stealing votes and sort of very corrupt urban machines, and they suggested to reform urban governance to make it much more of a managerial kind of city governance geared towards municipal socialism, a term taken from the British context again, which refers to the city basically being the owner and manager of many of the public works, utilities, roads, public transport, a kind of local welfare state, if you want. This was one of the primary goals of the progressivists. Another of the policy goals was the fight against big business, against the big corporations, with the first antitrust law also in the 1890s, the Sherman Act. So the idea of government intervening in order to keep business from concentrating to ever bigger companies. And another important social policy